a combat veteran, with 3 silver stars, and a hiring manager who handed her a Psych Eval designed to screen out candidates like you. She sat in a beige chair in a beige room in a building that smelled like recycled air and someone else's ambition, and she filled out every single question. Not because she had to, because she already knew what was going to happen next. Her name was Zola Pemberton, 29 years old, 5 feet 7. Veteran of 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, former staff sergeant with the 75th Ranger Regiment, which, if you don't know what that means she had done things in the dark, in places that don't appear on tourist maps, that most people couldn't imagine doing in broad daylight with a full night's sleep and a warm meal. She had trained alongside men twice her size and outperformed most of them. She had been recommended for the Special Forces' assessment and selection program by 2 commanding officers who didn't give recommendations lightly. She had also, 3 weeks ago, walked into Halverson Tactical Solutions in downtown Atlanta and applied for a senior analyst position with her DD2 FEEN, her service record, and a résumé that would have made a recruiter's eyes water. The hiring manager's name was Cavanaugh. He looked at her résumé for approximately 4 seconds. Then he slid a packet across the table and told her this was standard procedure for all candidates. She knew it wasn't. You have to understand something about Zola before this story makes sense. She did not come from money. She did not come from connections. She grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Point, Georgia, raised by her grandmother after her mother left and her father deployed, and then didn't come back from that either. Different reasons, same result. Her grandmother, a woman named Ruth, who wore house slippers to the mailbox and kept a Bible on the kitchen counter next to the hot sauce, used to say that the only thing you could count on in this world was what you built with your own 2 hands. So Zola built. She studied. She ran track. She graduated in the top 5% of her class at Banneker High School. She turned down a partial academic scholarship to Georgia State because the Army offered her something the scholarship couldn't, a way to become someone that nobody could ever dismiss. She wanted to earn something so undeniable that the world would have no choice but to see it. And she did. She earned her Ranger tab at 22. She earned her first Silver Star at 24 for pulling 2 wounded soldiers out of a kill zone under active fire while maintaining communications and coordinating air support simultaneously. Her citation, the actual official U.S. Army citation, used the phrase conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity. She separated from the Army at 28 with an honorable discharge, a folder full of commendations, and a clear plan. She wanted to move into the private defense sector. She had the tactical background, the analytical skills, the security clearance. She had everything. What she didn't have, apparently, was whatever Cavanaugh was looking for. The Psych Eval wasn't a standard Psych Eval. She knew this because she had taken standard Psych Evals. She had been evaluated by military psychologists, by CRE instructors, by selection board members who had spent decades figuring out what breaks a person and what doesn't. She knew what those assessments looked like. She knew what they were measuring. This one was different. This one had questions like describe a situation where you deferred to a supervisor, even when you believed you were right, and rate your comfort level working in environments where decisions are made above your pay grade, and how do you respond when a colleague challenges your credibility in a professional setting. These were not questions designed to assess capability. These were questions designed to find reasons to say no. She filled out every single one. She answered honestly, the way she always answered, the way the Army had trained her to answer, with specificity and without embellishment. She described a situation in Kandahar in 2019 where she had disagreed with a tactical call and followed the chain of command anyway and been right to do so, and how she had processed that afterward. She wrote 2 full paragraphs. She handed the packet back to the receptionist on her way out. Drew Cavanaugh emailed her 3 days later to say they were moving forward with other candidates. He did not explain why. He did not have to. Here is what Drew Cavanaugh did not know about Zola Pemberton. He did not know that she had spent the last 8 months, in between her transition counseling appointments and her part-time contracting work, and the Tuesday dinners she still had at her grandmother's house in East Point, quietly building something. It started with a phone call. A former colleague from her second deployment, a man named Terrence who had gotten out 2 years before her and gone into private security consulting, called her in November and told her he'd heard about a new firm launching in Atlanta. Mid-size, private defense, government contracts. The kind of shop that was going to need people who understood both the tactical and analytical sides of the work. He said the founder was a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Forsyth, retired, and that she was serious. Zola had looked Forsyth up. Then she had looked her up some more. Then she had reached out. The two of them had met for coffee at a place in Midtown in December, and what was supposed to be a 45-minute conversation had turned into 3 hours. Forsyth had spent 22 years in Army intelligence. She had run operations that Zola had only read about in heavily redacted after-action reports. She was methodical and direct, and she had zero tolerance for the kind of institutional gatekeeping that had defined too many veterans' transitions out of service. She was also, it turned out, in the process of building the kind of risk assessment framework that the private defense sector had never seen before, and she needed someone to pressure test it. They had been working together, informally, since January. Zola had been reviewing Forsyth's methodology, identifying vulnerabilities, suggesting structural improvements based on her own operational experience. It was supposed to be a consulting arrangement. It had turned into something considerably more involved. By the time Zola walked into Drew Cavanaugh's office in March, she had already contributed to 3 drafts of what Forsyth was calling the Integrated Personnel Risk Model, a framework for evaluating human reliability in high-stakes defense environments. She had rewritten the behavioral indicators section from scratch. She had caught an error in the probability weighting algorithm that would have produced systematically skewed results across an entire population of candidates. She had not told anyone at Halverson Tactical Solutions any of this. There had been no reason to. Drew Cavanaugh had a particular theory about talent. He had held it for a long time, long enough that it had calcified from a theory into something he treated as fact. The theory went like this. The best candidates for sensitive analytical roles were the ones who were easiest to read. Pedigreed backgrounds, familiar trajectories, the right schools, the right internships, the right professional associations. People who looked and sounded like the people who had already been doing this work for decades. Combat veterans made him uncomfortable, not because he thought they weren't capable. He would have said, if asked, that he had enormous respect for their service, but because they didn't fit neatly. They brought variables he didn't know how to account for. They had done things he couldn't evaluate. They asked questions that made him feel like he was being assessed instead of doing the assessing. Zola Pemberton, specifically, had made him feel this way from the moment she sat down across from him. He had given her the Psych Eval, hoping she would screen herself out. Most people did. The questions were designed, not officially, not in any way he would have committed to writing, to identify candidates who were, in his private vocabulary, too much. People who had too much confidence, too much operational specificity in their answers, too much of a record that he'd have to spend time actually understanding. She had not screened herself out, so he had moved forward with other candidates. He had told himself this was a reasonable business decision. Zola found out what happened to her application 3 weeks later, not from Cavanaugh, but from Terrence, who had heard from someone at the firm that the position had been filled by a candidate with an MBA from Emory and 2 years of experience at a consulting firm that had never held a government contract. She was not surprised. She was not even particularly angry, which surprised her. She drove home from Terrence's apartment that evening. On I-285, the Atlanta skyline lit up to her left, and she thought about her grandmother. Ruth had once told her, during a specific conversation that Zola had not thought about in years, but that came back to her fully formed on that drive home, like her grandmother's voice had been waiting in the back of her mind all along, that sometimes the door that closes is the door you were never supposed to walk through anyway. Zola had been 12 years old at the time and had not fully understood what Ruth meant. She understood now. The Forsyth Group launched quietly in May. There was no press release. There was no announcement. There was a federal contracting registration, a suite of offices on the 14th floor of a building in Buckhead, and a website that contained exactly one page with exactly one paragraph of text. Adrienne Forsyth had been deliberate about this. She did not want attention before the work was ready. She wanted the work to speak. The Integrated Personnel Risk Model was presented for the first time at a closed-door briefing in Washington, D.C. in June. 14 people were in the room. 3 of them represented Department of Defense procurement offices. 2 were from the intelligence community. The rest were senior figures in the private defense sector whose names and affiliations Zola was not authorized to share and won't. Forsyth presented the framework. She walked through the methodology, the research base, the validation studies they had run over the previous 6 months. She explained the behavioral indicators section and where it had come from. She explained the probability weighting algorithm and why it was structured the way it was. She gave credit where credit was due. At one point, she said, and this is a direct quote, because Zola was in the room and has not forgotten it, "The integrity of this model owes a great deal to a woman who spent 5 years doing work that most of us in this room only read reports about. She found the flaw that would have broken this. I'd like her to speak to that." Zola stood up. She was wearing a navy blazer she had bought specifically for this meeting. Her hair was natural, pulled back. She had a single page of notes that she ended up not using. She spoke for 11 minutes. She explained the flaw she had found in the algorithm. She explained what it would have produced if it had gone undetected. A systematic bias toward a specific type of candidate profile that would have made the model worse than useless, would have actively undermined the purpose it was designed to serve. She explained her fix. She explained why it worked. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that she had time to wonder if she had said something wrong. Then one of the DoD representatives asked her a question. Then another one did. Then all 3 of them were talking at once, and Forsyth was smiling the quiet, controlled smile of someone who had known exactly how this was going to go. Here is something worth knowing about the private defense sector in Atlanta. It is not a large world. People know each other. Deals get done over lunches that don't appear on any calendar. Reputations travel. What happened in that briefing room in Washington in June was not a secret, and by July it was not a well-kept one. By August, 3 firms had reached out to Zola directly. She spoke to all 3. She turned down 2 of them. The third was a conversation she found genuinely interesting, with a man named Patrick Osei, who ran a mid-size risk management firm and had heard about the Forsyth briefing from someone who had been in the room and had immediately understood what it meant. She did not take that meeting either, ultimately. She had something better. Forsyth had offered her a partnership, not a senior analyst position, not a directorship, a partnership with equity in a firm that was now being contacted by procurement offices that were tired of frameworks that hadn't been stress-tested by anyone who had ever actually operated in a high-stakes environment. Zola accepted. She went home that night and called her grandmother. Ruth was 73 and still wore house slippers to the mailbox and still kept the Bible next to the hot sauce. And she listened to the whole thing, and when Zola finished, she said, Baby, I know. That was all. It was enough. Drew Cavanaugh heard about the Forsyth Group in September. He heard about it the way people hear about things in a small professional world. Sideways, over drinks at a networking event. From someone who mentioned it casually, as if he obviously already knew. He did not already know. He asked some follow-up questions that he tried to make sound casual, and that were not casual at all. And he went home that night and looked up the firm online. He found the one-paragraph website. He found the federal contracting registration. He found, through a contact of a contact, a summary of what had been presented at the June briefing. He sat with this information for a long time. He thought about the 4 seconds he had spent looking at a résumé in March. He thought about the beige room and the packet of questions he had handed across the table. He thought about the email he had sent. 3 sentences, no explanation, and the position he had filled with a candidate who had, in the intervening months, turned out to be not quite what he had hoped. He did not call Zola. He did not know what he would have said. He put his phone down and looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline and thought about a framework he had never bothered to understand, built by a woman he had decided in 4 seconds wasn't what he was looking for. The city looked the same as it always had. He was the only thing that had changed. People ask sometimes, not Zola, she doesn't talk about this publicly, but people who know the story ask whether she had planned it this way, whether the whole thing was a long game, a setup, some kind of deliberate arc toward a specific ending. She didn't. She will tell you that herself. She applied to Halverson because it was a reasonable opportunity, and she was qualified for it. And when it didn't work out, she was disappointed the way any qualified person is disappointed when a door closes for reasons that have nothing to do with their ability to do the work. She was not executing a strategy. She was doing what her grandmother had always told her to do. She was building, with her own 2 hands, the thing that was most true to who she was. The rest of it, the partnership, the briefing, the small revolution that the Forsyth Group was quietly conducting in a sector that had not been seriously challenged in 20 years. That was not a plan. That was what happened when you stop trying to walk through doors that were never built for you and you build your own instead. The Forsyth Group's second briefing was in October. More people were in the room this time. The framework was more refined. The methodology had been extended based on 6 additional months of validation work. And the behavioral indicators section, the part that Zola had rewritten from the ground up, had been tested against actual outcomes in 3 different contractor populations and had outperformed every existing model in the field. One of the procurement representatives from the June briefing came back. He brought 2 colleagues. Before the briefing started, he shook Zola's hand and said he had been thinking about her presentation for 4 months, and he had some questions. She told him she had some answers. She wasn't performing confidence. She wasn't putting on anything. She was just a woman who had spent 5 years doing things in the dark, in places that didn't appear on tourist maps, and then come home and built something real, and now she was standing in a room full of people who were finally paying attention. Her grandmother had a name for moments like this. She called them due, not reward, not vindication, not payback, just due. The thing that was always going to find its way to you, eventually, if you did the work and kept your hands clean and didn't let anyone convince you that their ceiling was your ceiling too. Somewhere in the city of Atlanta, in a building that smells like recycled air and someone else's ambition, Drew Cavanaugh is probably still running his assessments, probably still sliding packets across tables, probably still spending 4 seconds on résumés that deserve 4 hours. That's his story to carry. This one belongs to Zola, and she's just getting started.